Good afternoon. My name is Hina Jillani. I'm a lawyer practicing in the Supreme Court of Pakistan. I'm also a human rights defender. I have the honor today of having with me on the same panel Dr. Shirin Ebadi, a world-known human rights activist, as well as a lawyer from Iran, now in exile. And we are hoping that we will be hearing from her about her experiences, especially a focus on the rights of women in a Muslim world. So I don't see any need to introduce Dr. Shirin Ebadi in any more detail. I think everybody knows her. She needs no introduction. With that, I would like to hand over to Dr. Ebadi for her presentation. Thank you, Doctor.
Honorable Madam Hina Jillani, to organizers of this conference, ladies and gentlemen, I feel honored to have this opportunity to speak with you, the kind people of our neighboring country, Pakistan. I very much hope to visit your wonderful country one day and meet with you in person. My dear friends, I would like to say a few words about the legal situation of women in Islamic countries and societies. Unfortunately, women suffer from discrimination in most Islamic countries. I will give you a few examples of the discriminatory laws in Iran, which were adopted in the wake of the 1979 Islamic Revolution. Based on Iran's penal code, the diya, or blood money, paid to women is half the amount paid to men. For instance, if, let's say, a pregnant woman is killed in a car crash and they discover that the baby's gender was male, then the blood money compensation paid for the mother is half of the amount paid for the unborn male fetus. In other words, a male fetus who hasn't even entered the world is worth twice as much as a mother because she's a woman. Another example, the testimony of two women in court is equivalent to the testimony of one man. Or with regards to some offenses such as consumption of alcohol or homosexuality, women's testimony is deemed invalid. Or a man can have up to 4 wives. He can divorce any of these wives at any time he chooses. Whereas it is very difficult and often impossible for a woman to divorce her husband. There are countless other discriminatory laws against women, all of which were adopted after the Islamic Revolution in Iran. Unfortunately, we do not see such laws only in Iran. Discrimination is a common scourge in most Islamic societies. Whenever Muslim women object to these discriminatory laws, they are told that these laws are derived from the Islamic Sharia law, and opposing them is tantamount to opposing Islam. Now, is such a statement correct? If we are Muslims, should we live the way Muslims lived 1400 years ago? Of course not.
حکومت‌ها مانند جمهوری اسلامی ایران
Governments
پشت
such
نام
as the Islamic
اسلام
Republic of
پنهان
Iran
شدن
are
و
falsely
قوانین
hiding
خودشون
behind
رو با
Islam. They
بنابرش
justify their
غلطی
laws
از
through their
اسلام توضیح
correct
میکنن
interpretation of Islam.
یا باور میشوم که فقط حکومت‌های رسمی نیستند
I should note,
که چنین
however, that
اهداف
such discriminatory
تبعیض‌آمیز
laws and
و نادرستی
incorrect
دارند.
interpretations of Islam are not
فراموش
exclusive
نکنید
to
رفتار
governments,
گروه‌هایی مانند
but there are various
داعش،
movements such as Daesh,
طالبان، بوکو
Taliban,
حرام
or
رو
Boko
بازم
Haram,
که
who do
اونها هم
likewise
مدعی
mistreating women.
پیروی از اسلام بودند. نکته جالب این که در برخی از کشورهای
It is
اسلامی
interesting, though, that in some
وضعیت
Islamic
زنان
countries,
هنوز
although
هم
women are still
متفاوته،
subjected to
اما
discrimination, their situation
کاملا
is
متفاوت از
different to
یکدیگره.
that of Iran.
به عنوان مثال من در سال
For
1981
example, in
شغل خودم رو چون
1981,
زن
I
بودم
was dismissed from my profession as a
قضاوتی
judge
از دست
because
دادم
the Iranian
به این
government
دلیل
claims
که
that women should
میگفتن که
not
زنان
sit in
را
judgment over men
بر مردان
and
حکومتی
cannot
نیست.
work as judges.
چند سال بعد می‌بینیم در همسایگی ایران و در حکومت جمهوری
Yet just a
اسلامی
decade later,
پاکستان
a woman,
خانم
this
بی‌نظیر
Benazir
بوتو
Bhutto, was
به
elected
نخست وزیر
prime
منصوب
minister
میشه.
in our neighboring country of Islamic Republic of
مثال
Pakistan.
دیگر وضعیت متفاوت زنان
Or I could give you the
در
example
کشورهای
of
اسلامی
the
رو نشون میده.
situation of women in Tunisia.
مثلا کشور تونس
And
وضعیت اونا
as they
چرا
appear to
از
be in
جهت
a much better
قوانین
situation
بهتر از
than
سایر
women
کشورها.
in several other Muslim countries.
این تفاوت‌ها از کجا سرچشمه میگیره؟
Where do these differences
بسیاری از
emanate from?
فقهای نواندیش بر این اعتقادند
Many modern
که قوانین
jurists
شریعت
believe
به
that
دو
the
دسته
laws of
است.
Sharia are divided into two
یک
categories.
دسته قوانینی که روابط انسان
The
رو با
first
خدا
category
سازی می‌کنه.
concerns laws that govern man's
مانند
relationship with
نماز
God,
روزه.
such as
این
daily
دسته
prayers
از
and fasting.
قوانین غیر قابل تغییر هستند
These
و
laws
تا
are
زمانی که کسی
immutable
خودش
and
رو
must be
مسلمان
obeyed if
می‌دانه
one considers oneself a
باید
Muslim.
اونها رو اجرا کنه. به عنوان مثال
For
ما
example,
مسلمانان
based on this category of
باید
laws,
نماز رو
Muslims are expected
همون گونه
to
که
pray
حضرت
in
محمد
exactly the same manner as the
بخوانیم.
Prophet Muhammad did.
یعنی
In other
در
words,
قرن 21
in the
هم
21st century, we must
قرن
perform
14
the act of worship in exactly the same way as it was performed in the 14th century.
دسته دوم قوانین
Now, the
شریعت
second category of Sharia laws,
قوانینی هستند
they
که
concern
روابط
laws
مردم
that
رو
regulate
تشکیل و
human
تنظیم
relations with
کنند
each other.
و عنصر زمان و مکان در
This
اونها
category of
مؤثر
laws
است.
must conform to the spirit of the
مانند
Sharia law,
قوانین
but
مربوط به
their
خانواده،
enforcement can be adapted to the
مجازات،
exigencies of time and place,
اجارت و غیره.
such as issues related to the family,
این دسته از
punishment of the
قوانین رو
child, trade,
باید
so on
با
and
حفظ
so
روح
forth.
قانون
So, as
و
I said,
حفظ زمان
this
و
category
مکان
must
تغییر
conform
بدیم
to the
تا
spirit of
قابل
the
اجرا
Sharia,
بشه.
although
به عنوان مثال
adaptable to the exigencies of time and place. For example,
در
amputation
قرآن
of a
کریم هست.
thief's hand is
این
explicitly
قانون
mentioned in the Holy
یک
Quran.
روح کلی داره.
This
و اون
law
این است که
conforms to the general spirit of the Sharia,
دزدی
which
بده
is that theft
و دزد رو بایستی
is a
مجازات.
disgraceful wrong act and the thief
اما
must be punished.
این که چگونه باید
But
مجازات
how
بکنیم
that thief
این
should be
دیگه بستگی
punished,
به
it depends
زمان
on the
داره.
exigencies of the
به
time.
عنوان مثال 1400 سال قبل زندان به این صورت امروزی نبود.
For instance, some
بریدن
1400 years
انگشتان
ago,
و یا
prisons
هرچی
were not the
تصادف
same as they
کار
are
رایجی بود.
today. It was not uncommon to cut off a thief's fingers or wrists in the 14th century. In some cases in Europe, in that time, thieves were even burnt alive. Nowadays, in the 21st century, such punishments are no longer carried out. They have prisons for them. So we could put a thief in prison rather than amputating their hands. In so doing, they preserve the spirit of the Sharia, which prohibits theft and requires thieves to be punished. Now, the important question that comes to mind is why Islamic fundamentalists, be they part of the political apparatus, as they are in Iran, or a movement such as Boko Haram, they're not willing to choose that method. Why? And what is even more tragic is that some Muslim families living in the West, they continue their fundamentalist practices and oppress their wives and daughters under the pretext of abiding by Islamic rules, despite the fact that Western laws forbid oppression of women. For example, they force their teenage daughters to marry against their will or subject them to female genital mutilation. Now, the roots of this behavior can be found in the patriarchal culture. This culture uses all kinds of misinterpretations to justify its wrongdoings. Of course, abuse of religion to justify patriarchal culture is not specific to Islam and can also be found in other Abrahamic religions. For example, in Islam, women must pray behind men, while in Christianity, no woman has ever been elected pope or headed a religious community. Another example is the myth of creation, the story of Eve, for whose sin mankind was banished from the Garden of Eden. Now we have to ask ourselves, what was Eve's sin? Where is paradise? Is God not supposed to be just? So why should the entire mankind be punished for one person's sin? In all Abrahamic religions, we see that men are the ones who've interpreted the scriptures, and therefore religion has become a means for them through which they oppress women and discriminate against them. Now the time has come for women to learn the religion correctly, instead of following it blindly and accepting every word interpreted by men. Hitherto, men have interpreted the sacred religious books. Women must now strive to present their own correct interpretation of these religious books, and in so doing take this weapon away from men. With regards to patriarchal culture, it is important for me to note that although women are victims of this wrong culture, they're also transmitters of this culture.
بالاخره
Bear in
در
mind that every man who is a Buddhi
مادر
has been
تربیت
raised by a mother.
من این فرهنگ رو شبیه بیماری هموفیلی
I
میکنم.
liken the patriarchal culture to
این
hemophilia.
بیماری در این بیماری
Hemophilia is a
یک
genetic
زخم
disorder
کوچک
in which a
میتواند
slightest cut can lead
خونریزی
to
زیادی
excessive
تولید
bleeding.
کنه و این یک
It
بیماری
is transmitted from mother to son,
که
not
از
the daughter.
مادر به فرزند پسر منتقل میشه. یعنی مادری که این ژن رو داره
And patriarchal culture
پسرش بیمار میشه و
works
دخترش
in exactly the
بیمار
same
نمیشه.
way as hemophilia does.
فرهنگ پدر سالار هم همین گونه عمل میکنه. برای مبارزه با این فرهنگ غلط باید زنان
To
رو
fight
به
this wrong culture,
صلاح دانش
women must be
مجهز
equipped with a weapon of
و
knowledge.
شیوه‌های مختلف عملکرد این فرهنگ رو
They
به
must be
اونها یاد
taught
بدیم
various ways in which this culture
و به همین
operates
دلیل
and
که
teach them
بنیانگرایان
to find ways of
اسلامی
combating
با
it,
تحصیل دختران مخالف هستند.
which is exactly why Islamic
نمونه
fundamentalists
این
oppose
تفکر
female
رو
education.
در
We've seen
آتش
recent
زدن
examples of this ideology in the
مدارس
burning of girls'
دخترانه
schools by
در
the Taliban
سالهای
in
گذشته در
Afghanistan in the recent years.
افغانستان توسط طالبان دیدیم
Or we've seen attacks
یا
on girls' schools by
حمله به
another
مدارس
fundamentalist group,
دخترانه
Boko
توسط
Haram
بوکو
in
حرام هم به
Nigeria.
همین دلیل بوده. و سخن آخر آنکه کلید
My final
رهایی
word:
زنان مسلمان
education
از
is the
قید
key to freeing
سنت‌های غلط
Muslim
و
women from the
فرهنگ
shackles of
پدرسالار
wrong
فقط
traditions and
آموزش است.
patriarchal culture.
ممنونم از اینکه
I would like
با
to thank you
حوصله
all
به
for
حرفهای
having
من گوش
patiently
کردید.
paid attention
آماده
to my
پاسخگویی
speech, and I
به
am ready to
سوالاتی
answer
اگر
any
باشه هستم.
questions that you may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ebadi. Just a few thoughts before I pose one or two questions relevant to your presentation to you, Dr. Ebadi. I listened with a great deal of interest to the kind of laws that you mentioned where, that are existing in many Muslim countries. And I didn't find much difference in the application of such laws in my country either, except that in the Qisas and Diyat law, we are slightly less unfortunate, and Diyat for women is the same as for men. So there, at least, we have not been given a second-class status. However, the evidentiary laws do retain the requirement that was brought in during the military regime of Ziaul Haq, where in some cases of criminal trials, the evidence of women is of less weight than men, and in some cases not admissible at all to prove, for instance, murder in the first degree. So I think we do suffer in many countries like this, but I would like to see societies not as Muslim or non-Muslim, but societies which are governed either by civilized constitutional guarantees or those that deny the status of equality and by law authorize or accept and tolerate discrimination between citizens on the basis of gender. Now, I remember the time that we had women's movements resisting the application of such laws, in the Middle East, in your country, Dr. Ebadi, and in mine. And one silver lining of these events was that it gave rise to very strong women's movements. And a lot of feminist thought on how women's status has to be determined in constitutional democracies. And the fight was all over that if you are a nation that wants constitutional democracies and are still tolerating inequality in your constitutions, then there is an ambiguity and a contradiction in the national thought about democracy. And if that inequality is justified on the basis of religion or of culture or any kind of tradition and practice that you want to uphold, despite the fact that it denies fundamental freedoms to certain communities and on the basis of gender, then I do think that there is a contradiction in our thought about democracy. So I've always said that democracy itself has to be gender sensitive before it can be a fulfilling aspiration for everyone, including women. And I think it is in this context that I see of the status of women in societies which practice Islam as a majority religion, as a religion of the majority of the population. During Ziaul Haq's time in the 1980s, I remember it was these very issues that triggered this strong women's movement, which resisted much of what could have happened if this movement had not emerged. The laws had already come in, but the impact of those laws and the harm that those laws could have done were in many ways prevented because of the women's movement and the resistance that came from the women. And you're very right, Dr. Ebadi, when you said that the kind of punishments that were prescribed under some of the laws that had been adopted in the name of Islam, for instance, in the case of the Hudud laws, they could not be implemented. Stoning to death or cutting off of limbs was not something that could ever happen in the contemporary society worldwide, leave alone in Pakistan. And they never were. We are lucky that as a nation that we did not have to go through the trauma of watching the public implementation of such horrifying laws. So at least we were saved that. But it was the women's movement whose 25 years of resistance finally resulted in making those particular laws dormant, if not in totally removing them. So for instance, the zina law today is almost not practiced. It remains on the statute books because of the state's lack of courage to confront the religious groups that they fear can have street power and challenge the writ of the state if these laws are removed. But we must also remember, and I take Pakistan as an example, and I would like you to respond perhaps at the end of what I'm saying on where is the public pressure for such laws. In Pakistan, there was never a movement of the people to bring in these laws. These were laws imposed from the above by a regime that wanted some reason to make itself legitimate for overthrowing a popularly elected government and making a military coup. So they used religion. They also used religion for the very reason you have already said, to silence dissent. If you say anything that challenges discrimination or legal oppression of any section of the society in the name of religion, if you say anything against it, then you're committing blasphemy. So that was a way of silencing people. I think that even today we are confronting that. There was a time very recently when a law to reform the legal age of marriage was proposed, and the women's movement was backing that law. And on the social media, all women activists were attacked by saying that by supporting such a law, women were committing blasphemy. There is no place in Islam for any restriction on the age of marriage of women. So these are some of the things we are still confronting. At the same time, I'm conscious that in our constitution, for instance, there is an equality clause that is perhaps one of the best equality provisions in amongst many others in the world. Our constitution says everyone has the right to equality before the law and to the equal protection of the law, and there shall be no discrimination on the basis of sex alone. This is a very clear prescription for non-discrimination. But at the same time that this constitutional clause exists, we have state-sponsored legislation that discriminates. We have courts that hesitate to give us that equality because of the pressure that they feel from the religious groups in this country who have actually not, they don't have a proportionate support within the masses, proportionate to the influence they exert on the state. And the state has obviously nurtured and fostered these groups, and that's why it always capitulates to their demands. So I do think that here, the only way that we feel that we can survive and overcome the challenges to our claims for equality is by depending on strong movements for human rights and strong movements for women. And believe me, as a Pakistani, I know that in the 80s, the environment that surrounded us at that time, when what was happening in Afghanistan was very pertinent, and our rulers at that time in Pakistan were very interested in creating the same kind of environment in Pakistan. We didn't become Afghanistan. We didn't. And we did not submit to the Taliban kind of rule because of the resistance of the civil society. So I know that we are capable of it. We have the commitment to do that. And at the same time, I think that women have to be convinced that not only are their claims to equality legitimate, they must pursue these without being on the defensive. They have every right to pursue them, and they have every right to resist any kind of repression in that respect. So I do believe that we are still hopeful that despite the fact that we have ups and downs, and the women's status always is a situation where we take one step forward and two steps backward, in many of the Muslim countries that we know the situation of at the moment. But at the same time, there is always hope. But one question that always remains in my mind is, how far is this a question of religion? And how much does the politics of the time affect the kind of legislation that we confront? And is this legislation meant more as a tool of repression or as any kind of a move to bring Islam to the people? You have experience of that in Iran. Just a little bit, if you could give us some idea of how you see those times and what you see as a consequence in Iran after so many decades. How do you see that situation? Has it empowered women? Has it empowered the Iranian society on the whole to curtail women's rights? And whether the Iranian society in any way was weakened because the women's rights were curtailed? Over to you.
Thank you very much. Your questions were very good. Excellent. I would like to say that we have an extremely strong feminist movement in Iran. And at present, we have some 200 well-known feminists behind bars in Iran, which goes to show how active the Iranian women have been that has resulted in their imprisonment. Now, Iran and Afghanistan differ in another thing as well. You were fortunate that you never had a theocracy as such. But unfortunately, in Iran, we had a revolution which was led by Khomeini, which was a high-ranking Shiite cleric. And also we have a supreme jurisconsult now as our leader. And unfortunately, our constitution is very much behind, and it's not as progressive as your constitution is. You said in your constitution, they say very explicitly that everyone is equal before the law, but our constitution does not say that. Our constitution says that all legislation that has been ratified by Majlis or Parliament must be in keeping with the Sharia law. Once the law has been approved by the Majlis, it's sent to a watchdog called the Guardian Council. This Guardian Council is made up of 6 clerics, and they have to make sure that the law that has been passed by Parliament is compatible with the Sharia. So, and if they reject it, the law is sent back to Parliament. And these 6 jurists are appointed by the supreme leader who has absolute authority, Khamenei. So as you can see, Islam in our country is based on the opinion of one person. And that one person, who currently is Khamenei, who is our leader, or Khomeini, the former one, are very regressive, illiterate, ignorant. Now, I am not afraid of saying that they are illiterate and ignorant, because what they say is in no way compatible with Islam. Just 2 days ago, on Iranian national TV, women who were presenters on TV were ordered not to cross their legs while they're sitting there, because it's against Islam for a woman to sit crossing her legs. Now, tell me, in what Islamic book have you seen anything, any laws about how a woman should sit? Or in what part of Islam or Hadith have they said if a woman's hair is showing, she should be flogged? Unfortunately, this is the situation our country is in at the moment, which is why Iranian women unanimously believe that Iran has to become a secular country. We have to separate religion from state. They should no longer stipulate in the constitution that all legislation must be compatible with Islamic Sharia. And the interpretation of Islam should not be made by just one person who is the supreme jurisconsult. Iranian constitution has turned Iran into a despotic country. Iranian people are really striving for democracy, but every time they are repressed, and there is a massive crackdown on people when they go out to stage their protests. For example, last November 2019, to be precise, there was we had nationwide protests in Iran which started over the rise in the price of petrol. The Iranian government during those protests, cut off access to internet for 3 days. And in those 3 days, they killed 1,500 people, protesters on the streets. Why? Because they protested against the rise in the price of petrol. And sadly, what did the world do? They remained silent. I remember at the time I was invited to give a speech in France. President Macron had asked me to dinner, and I gave a press conference in which I said, when in my country so many people are killed by government forces, why are you remaining silent? Why are you not saying anything? Is it because you're worried about nuclear energy? And now you expect me to come and be a guest at your dinner party? As a result of that press conference, the French journalists became a bit more active on that subject, and Macron agreed to voice his objections to the Iranian government. But unfortunately, in general, for many years, the world has shut its eyes to the violation of human rights in Iran. All the world is paying attention to is whether Iran is going to acquire atomic bomb or not, and how Iran's relationship is with other countries. Of course, these are important issues. I'm not denying that, but I'm saying that because of the nuclear issue and because of other countries' interest, they should turn a blind eye to the systematic crackdown on activists, human rights activists in Iran. Our prisons are filled with prisoners of conscience. I'll give you another example. The age of penal responsibility in Iran is very low. It's 9 years for girls and 15 for boys. This is terrifying. For that very reason, juvenile offenders under the age of 18 are given the death penalty. They're actually executed. Last year only, we had 3 executions of juveniles under the age of 18. And at present, there are some 90 juveniles are on death row. Believe me, I have communicated with UNICEF so many times. I've said, have you fallen asleep? Do you not see what is going on in Iran? Why are you not putting pressure on the Iranian government to reform its laws? It's the 21st century. Children are being executed. But unfortunately, all the world thinks about is its own security and the security of Europe. And they're just worried lest Iran disturbs the security of the world or the region. But they have to bear in mind that if there is democracy in Iran, if there is people's power in Iran, Iran will have a better relationship with its neighbors. Iran will not be a threat to the rest of the world. Iran will not need a nuclear bomb. Iran is governed by a few people who are acting in any way they choose in the name of Islam. Iran is a rich country, and they're spending the money to buy weapons for Houthis in Yemen or Hezbollah in Lebanon, or help Bashar al-Assad in Syria. Iranian workers have no rights in Iran at the moment. Every day we have street protests in Iran because people have had enough. They don't have enough to eat, whereas we are a rich country. Now my question to the West is this. Not only to the West, but to all educated people around the world. Why are you closing your eyes to the people of Iran, to the plight of our Iranian people? Why are you obsessed with the nuclear issue only? People of Iran are living on credit. They can't even afford, some of them, to buy their loaves of bread every day. And I repeat, Iran is a rich country, yet people have no money. Last week, I read a report in Iranian media, and it said that our Baluchis, who live on the Pakistan border, they prefer to go to Pakistan in order to receive medical treatment, because in Iran, in Baluchistan, Iran, the medical facilities are very limited and very poor. So they try and make it to Pakistan to receive this medical treatment. This is shameful for Iran, because Iran, as I said, is a rich country. Why is it that Iranian people have to come to Pakistan to receive medical treatment? And I tell you why they're poor. It's because Iran is spending the money on the Houthis in Yemen, or Hezbollah in Lebanon, or in a military, or its militia in Iraq or Syria. These are issues we are protesting against. But when the people go out to protest, they're either killed or they're put in prison. One of my closest colleagues, who is a well-known lawyer, like you are and I am, she is 80 years old, and she has been put in prison because she has protested. She was just handed down a 3-year prison sentence. She's 80, she's ill, and we don't even... Her name is Mrs. Giti Purfazil. Moreover, we have many writers, female lawyers, journalists, who are all in prison for the very reasons that I have mentioned, and all our problems emanate from the constitution of the Islamic Republic of Iran. And unless they amend this constitution, it is impossible to change the situation in Iran. The only solution is to make Iran a secular country. Yes, we are Muslims, but it is imperative for religion to be separated from state, and the constitution must stipulate that, like as in your constitution, everyone is equal before the law, irrespective of their gender or race. This is what lacks in our constitution, sadly. Even Sunni Muslims in Iran are being discriminated against. Last month alone, 5 Sunnis were executed on charges of supporting Saudi Arabia. We therefore stress that we want a secular, democratic country. That's the only solution. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think what you have said resonates with many of us with regard to how when states adopt a religion as a basis of their lawmaking, complications with regard to social relationships between citizens do arise. And vulnerabilities are created which should never be there. Before I end this session, because you have mentioned so many of the Iranian human rights defenders and feminist women who have gone to prison, let me express my deep sense of relief at the release of the Saudi women's rights activist who has remained in jail for almost for more than 2 years. And this is a women's rights activist who initiated the whole concept of freeing women from restrictions that are so anachronistic in the 21st century, like they're not being able to drive. And I don't know, there doesn't seem to be any logic behind the suffering that she has undergone in her country because of the incarceration that she had to suffer. I also would like to add to what you said, Dr. Ebadi, that it's not just Iran. What we are feeling as women's rights activists the world over is that the whole environment of religious intolerance, of religious extremism that we are confronting, not just in the countries with a majority of Muslim population, but in other countries as well. You look at India, you look at some of the countries where, like Sri Lanka in South Asia, in many other countries where religion has become a means of or a reason for people to be divided, politics to be polarized, communities to be targeted. I think this is a very dangerous world today, where religion, culture, ethnicity is being used to either target or privilege communities over others. And this is something that is destroying democracy. And as democracy wanes, women's rights also suffer. The status of women also suffers. The struggles that they are conducting at the moment suffer because our struggle and our way and means of taking our message forward depend on our freedom of movement, assembly, and expression. And when those are constrained, then no movements can prosper easily. So I do believe that this is a difficult time for all of us. And I hope that the struggle of people like you will inspire others all over the world, the younger generation, to stand up and fight for the rights. I think this is the message that I gave earlier on also, that the only thing on which we can depend is the strength of the people, the voice of the people. It is difficult to depend on states anymore. States have now taken on a shape of their own, and their interests now in many ways have come into conflict with the interest of the people and safeguarding the people's fundamental freedoms and rights. In some ways now, it doesn't seem to be of any interest to as far as the state is concerned. So I do believe that making our states or coercing our states to understand the meaning of equality, of non-discrimination, of making sure that, as you say, secular values are as important as people's affinity to their religion in their private lives. The state has no business to interfere in how people practice their religion. The state has no business to interfere in lawmaking processes, which should be controlled by the guarantees in the constitutions that we have, and the foremost guarantee is that of equality. So I agree with you to a great extent that now is the era where we really need to safeguard our rights with much more jealousy and much more vigilance than we have done before. So, and you know, a lot of things have changed. I cannot say that that life remains static. A lot of things have changed. Women's movements, the human rights movements, people's movement for democracy have achieved some progress. But as we achieve progress, we are then under a double burden. Number one, to strive to get more and more, and then to also strive to protect that which we already have. And this, I think, is an era where the second burden has become very challenging to preserve and to carry on. I think it's very important that those who have a name, those who people have seen to have struggled, those who have credibility and a voice in the global field, they should give this message very strongly to everyone, that our aim should always be to strive for our rights. Even the small successes are important for us. And we should perhaps never feel frustrated, hopeless, or cynical about the situation that we confront today. Especially the women's movements all over the world should be a good example for that. I think everywhere, in the Middle East, in Africa, in Latin America, in Europe, in Asia, especially my part of the world, in South Asia, women's movements have been very resilient, have stood up against pressures, against all kinds of endeavors of different lobbies, non-state actors as well as states, to discredit these movements and still continue. So thank you very much, Dr. Ebadi. It was a pleasure for me, and I am sure for the audience in Pakistan as well as everywhere else. As usual, hearing from you and listening to your experiences always gives us inspiration. Thank you very much.